fresh beef chuck roast, ground and seasoned, formed into links, cured, and ultimately smoked to become the absolute picture of summer perfection that is smoked skinless all beef hot dogs. I've made lots of sausage making videos in the past and even one hot dog making video, but I've yet to do one about making skinless hot dogs, or all beef hot dogs for that matter. So I've been craving a good hot dog lately, so I figured it was the perfect time to make this recipe. You know, for the longest time I was apprehensive about trying a type of sausage making that doesn't involve using natural casings. And I rather enjoy natural casing hot dogs, but there's not anything quite the same as a good old skinless hot dog like you'd get at the store or at the ballpark or whatever. So in this video, we're going to be grinding up a bunch of beef, mixing it up with our spices and seasonings, stuffing it into some temporary cellulose casings that will then be removed later, and slow smoking all of it until we've got the most beautiful, all natural, all beef, skinless hot dogs. The meat we're using to make these hot dogs is 100% beef chuck roast. I'm making a 5-pound batch, and each of these roasts are around 3.5 pounds. So I'll be grinding all of them both, and I'll weigh out and separate the 5 pounds I need when the time comes. But first, I'm going to go ahead and cut the roasts up into some small chunks, so they'll go through the grinder nice and easy. Nothing too specific or uniform is necessary, just make these big slabs of meat into smaller little pieces of meat. Then I'll load them all up onto a baking sheet, and this whole thing is going into the freezer for about 45 minutes, just to get very cold and harden up a bit, both of which will ensure a good grind when we get to that step. And thanks to the miracle of movie magic, that step is now. I've got my grinder set up, and I'm going to first run all this meat through using the medium coarse plate. Now to just start feeding it all through, all the meat, all the fat, and that grind is looking very nice. So after it's all ground with the medium coarse plate, back into the sheet tray it goes, and I'll pop it back into the freezer for another 20 or so minutes. And that's because I'll be doing a second grind using the fine grind plate. Grinding meat that's already been ground can be a little tedious if you don't have a particularly large or powerful grinder, but I'll just keep feeding that meat through little by little. I sometimes think about upgrading to a much heavier duty meat grinder, and it usually happens while I'm currently doing a second grind on sausage meat. Anyway, all my beef is double ground and looking very nice, and I've separated out the 5 pounds I need for these hot dogs, and we're ready to move on to the next step, which is the seasoning / emulsification step. After loading up that ground meat into my not quite large enough stand mixer, I'm going to mix it for a minute on low speed using the standard mixing paddle. And I've absolutely overfilled this thing, so I ended up having to use a spatula to keep the meat from spilling out as it mixed. After mixing for a minute or two, I'll add in all my other ingredients, starting with the salt, then the curing salt, also known as Prague powder number 1, then all my other seasonings, nutmeg, mustard powder, garlic powder, onion powder, white pepper, paprika, a little raw sugar, marjoram, and celery seed. I'll also be using a binder for these hot dogs, in this case, whole milk powder, and finally my liquid, in the form of some ice cold water. Now, something I want to specifically talk about, and that's how I'm measuring these ingredients. I know in all of my bread making and probably previous sausage making videos, I've talked about the importance of measuring your ingredients by weight, or at least the important ingredients. Particularly in the case of sausage making, you really need to dial in your salt content. And if you're doing a cured meat, which these hot dogs are, you need to dial in the curing salts that you're going to be using. In this case, Prague powder number 1, also known as pink curing salt. And in the case of my recipe today, we're doing 5 pounds of meat, and that calls for, in this case, 5.5 grams of the curing salt. So what I'm getting at is, if you want to get into sausage making, or bread making for that matter, you're going to need a scale that can measure in grams and ideally down to 1/10 of a gram. You're going to need a scale if you really want to get into this. But for some of the other ingredients, we're just going to measure in teaspoons and similar, because it's really just about the seasoning, and you don't have to be scientifically perfect when it comes to those things. And for the meat, we're just going to be measuring in pounds. And I know that we're kind of crossing the imperial versus metric line there a little bit, but it doesn't really matter. Anyway, back to it. Now to continue mixing all this stuff together while arduously trying to keep everything in the absurdly overfilled bowl. At this point, I wish I'd done a smaller batch, but the salt and cure is already in, so I'm gonna muscle through. I'll continue mixing until that ground meat is very thoroughly broken down into an absolutely sticky paste. It really doesn't take too long, even when I'm constantly fighting this blob of meat like a character in a John Carpenter movie. Anyway, once we've got a nice consistent meat paste, it's finally time to start making some hot dogs. So I'll start loading that meat up into my Lem sausage stuffing machine. This meat paste is ridiculously sticky and wants to completely stick to my gloves, but nobody asked the meat for its opinion, so in it goes. Give the machine a few cranks until some meat just starts coming out of the tube, and now to load up the casings. These hot dogs will ultimately be skinless and casingless, but they still have to be formed into their hot dog shape, and for that we use these temporary cellulose casings. They're very easy to use, and they work mostly like other casing types. They're pretty rigid though, so I can't fit as much of it onto the tube at one time, which just means our contiguous lengths of sausage won't be as long as if we'd used some really long natural casings. Anyway, I'll tie off the end just like I would with any casing, and start stuffing. I'll slowly crank the machine with my right hand, and I'll maintain some pressure where the casing leaves the tube with my left hand as the meat fills it up. And I'll mention that this meat paste requires a little extra force when cranking, compared to, say, a bratwurst with coarsely ground meat. I've said plenty of times that you really ought to get a real sausage stuffing machine like this if you want to get into sausage making. But for hot dogs, it's a must-have. There's absolutely no way that the crappy attachment for your KitchenAid or grinder is going to move this meat paste. You really need a press-style stuffer. I'll put a link in the video description to this machine, which I've been using for years and have made absolutely hundreds of pounds of sausage with. Anyhow, once I get near the end of my casing, I'll pull it off the tube, give the casing a few twists, and tie it off. Then load up some more casing, tie off one end, stuff it full of meat, tie off the other end, and repeat until all my meat is stuffed. Okay, casings are all filled and we can move on. First, I'll just snip the little bit of excess casing off the end of each of these, and now we're ready to make our individual links. Now we can make links by twisting, just like I do with any natural casing sausage. Lots of people do it this way, but between this dent meat mixture and the thicker cellulose casings, I prefer to do it with the string method. Basically, instead of twisting, I'll just use a bit of butcher's twine to tie off my links. Just a simple double knot is all it takes. Out of all the times I've made hot dogs with cellulose casings, the only time I've ever had a blowout was when twisting. It just puts too much pressure on the casings, but when using the butcher's twine method, I've never had a single casing tear, split, or explode. Anyway, once they're all linked up, I'll trim off the excess string, and then all of these dogs are going on wire racks and into the refrigerator overnight. This time is needed so that the cure, as well as the flavors, can develop, so we'll pick it back up tomorrow. One more thing I want to mention. Yes, I've got a whole elaborate setup of kitchen equipment here. We ground the meat, then we put it all in the stand mixer, but I want to mention that you don't necessarily have to have all these things if you want to make hot dogs like these. Since we're really just trying to break that meat down into an absolute ground up paste, you could forego the meat grinder and the stand mixer if you happen to have a pretty big food processor. You can pulse that meat a bunch of times until it's pretty broken down, then mix in your seasonings and the water and the other things. Keep blitzing it with that thing until it's all a total paste. I've seen people do it this way before and it seems to work fine. The one thing I'll mention is that it can be tricky if you're going to try to split your batch up into smaller batches so that they'll fit into the food processor. And that's because your ratios of salt and the curing salts have to be pretty specific to the weight of meat you're using. So if you were going to, say, break up a 5-pound batch into a couple of 2.5-pound batches, I would also divide the curing salt and the salt and pretty much everything else into absolutely separate batches. You can mix it all back together at the end when you start stuffing it, or if you do them in smaller batches, but just throw the curing salts all in one and the regular salt all in the other. However, you have to make sure that they're absolutely all blended and mixed together before you start the curing process and of course stuffing them into the sausage casings. You could do that by hand, but I really can't stress enough how thoroughly you're going to want to mix all that together to make sure that the cure and the salt is totally evenly distributed through all of the meat, no matter how many batches of what size you ran through your food processor. Okay, bright and early, and it's time to fire up the smoker. So I'll get some lump charcoal burning, and into the Oklahoma Joe offset it goes. Now we're going to be doing a very low temperature smoke, which is a sort of tricky thing with a small offset like this. We want to smoke these hot dogs at about 150 degrees, for which we need so few coals, we run into issues with those coals not being able to ignite the next few coals I add. So I'll be keeping about a half chimney of charcoal going throughout this whole cook and adding just a few coals at a time every once in a while, along with very small little chunks of oak to provide the smokiness. So after heating up the smoker and then letting the temperature come down to where I want it, I'll load it up with my links. It's pretty overcrowded in this small smoker, and that ended up overcooking a couple of the links nearest the firebox. Again, I probably should have just made a smaller batch. Anyway, after smoking these dogs for a couple hours at 150 degrees, I'm bumping up the heat to around 165 so I can get the internal temp of that meat to 150. In total, these dogs were on the smoker for a little over 3 hours, and they are looking very nice. These cellulose casings are smoke permeable, which means that red color is coming from the dogs and not the casing itself. At this point, I'm pulling them off the smoker, taking them back inside, and dropping them into some ice water. This will stop the cooking process and also make it easier to peel off those casings. After the ice water bath and then letting them dry on a rack for a little while, it's finally time to separate those links and remove the casings. The casings will slide, pull, and peel away with little effort, revealing some very nice looking smoky hot dogs. A quick cross-section close-up really shows the fruits of all this labor. Tell me that doesn't look like a legit all-beef hot dog. Though if you look closely at the pile, I'm sure you can see the ones that were a little too close to the firebox. But they still look great, and I'm excited to finally try one of them out. So let's grill one up. Obviously these are pre-cooked, so all I need to do is heat it back up and give it some grill marks. Slap it on a toasty bun, maybe a little raw onion, a drizzle of mustard. And that right there is one tasty all-beef hot dog. So that's about it. Yeah, there's a bunch of steps, but in my opinion, this is one of the easiest kinds of sausage to make with regards to the stuffing procedure and how forgiving those cellulose casings tend to be. And for anyone that doesn't like biting into a natural casing hot dog or sausage, these are perfect for that. And they package up and freeze great. In fact, most of the hot dogs I made in this video got vacuum sealed and are going right into the freezer. And check out the video description below for the full recipe for this exact batch of skinless hot dogs that I made. And be sure to like and subscribe to stay up to date with all our latest stuff, including future sausage making and smoking videos. Thanks for watching, and until next time, I'm John, and this is Great Lakes Country.